Hello and welcome back to Earthling Mushrooms video on how to grow mushrooms for absolute beginners. This is part 2 of a 12-part series, so if you haven't seen the first part, I would highly suggest watching that. But without further ado, let's get on with it. Okay, so part 2, what are mushrooms really? Before we dive into the hands-on part of growing mushrooms, it's definitely worth taking a minute to understand what mushrooms actually are. Because the more you understand them, the easier it will be to grow them, and the more appreciation you'll have for just how strange and powerful they really are. So let's start with this. Mushrooms are not plants. They don't make energy from sunlight, they don't have roots or leaves, and genetically they're actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants. Much like you, fungi breathe in oxygen and they exhale carbon dioxide. But unlike you, they digest food not by chewing or swallowing, but by releasing enzymes into the material that they live on, breaking it down externally, and then absorbing the nutrients through their cells. So what you're dealing with here is not just a vegetable or a food, it's an organism that sits in its own unique category of life, the fungi kingdom, or kingdom fungi. Now, here's something most people don't realize. The mushroom you see, the cap and stem, or the lion's mane, or the mushroom, that's just the fruiting body, like the apple on a tree or the flower on a plant. The actual organism is mostly hidden. It lives as a dense web of thread-like structures called mycelium, which is a kind of underground network that spreads out and grows through wood, straw, soil, coffee grounds, or whatever organic material it's feeding on. That mycelium might live for years, slowly digesting its environment, and when the time is right, under a little stress or temperature shifts or humidity spikes, it sends up mushrooms. Those are the reproductive structures, built to release spores, and then the cycle starts over again. When the mycelium produces the fruiting body, it isn't game over for the mycelium. It can continue to produce for many years to come, slowly growing larger and larger as it takes over new nutrient-rich substrates in its habitat. In fact, the largest living organism on Earth is a mushroom, or as you now know, it would be more appropriate to say the largest living organism is a network of mycelium that produces mushrooms, or more specifically, a honey fungus that produces honey mushrooms. A single underground network of mycelium spans over 2,000 acres of Oregon forest, and it's over 2,400 years old, which is crazy. This fungus was 400 years old by the time Cleopatra came into power in Egypt. But let's bring this back to cultivation. What kind of fungi do we grow, or can we grow? Fungi show up in ecosystems in a few different ways. When we talk about growing mushrooms, we're typically just talking about one category that houses many varieties of delicious and edible gourmet mushrooms and potent medicinal mushrooms. But it helps to understand the full picture. Which brings us to our first category, saprotrophic fungi, the decomposers. These fungi feed on dead organic material. They're the ones we cultivate. Think about many different types of oyster mushrooms, lion's mane, coral tooth, bear's head, chestnut, shiitake, enoki, beech, piapino, reishi, paddy straw, and many more. These species thrive on straw, sawdust, cardboard, and other clean agricultural waste, making them super sustainable, able to be cultivated indoor year-round, and a lot more predictable than varieties that rely on symbiosis to grow. And now speaking of symbiosis, let's talk about our second category, mycorrhizal fungi, the tree partners. These live in symbiosis with living trees. Their mycelium attaches to the roots and shares minerals in exchange for sugars. And they also play a crucial role in nutrient distribution between the trees. These fungi have been observed to revive dying trees by reallocating nutrients from other organisms in the network. Some examples would be chanterelle, porcini, morel, truffle, matsutake, rusula, lactarius, and many more. These mushrooms are quite popular in some regions in the world and command a very high price point, but that's because they're pretty much impossible to cultivate at home. They depend on very specific relationships with live roots, as I mentioned, meaning they're pretty much only able to be wild harvested. Mother Nature decides when you will see them on the menu at your local gastropub. And there are some exceptions, such as the outdoor morel and truffle cultivation happening in some parts of China, but this is highly unrealistic for a beginner grower, so we'll save that for another video. Now the last category we'll talk about, and probably the scariest seeming, is the parasitic fungi, or the infiltrators. These invade living hosts, plants, insects, and even other fungi. Cordyceps is probably the most famous example, known for growing out of insects in the wild, and now cultivated in controlled settings for supplements. Another famous example would be corn smut, or huitlacoche, which is a delicacy in Mexico. Across all of these categories, fungi serve one of the most important roles in nature, recycling. They break down complex materials like lignin and cellulose that no other organism can digest. They return nutrients to the soil, and they form the soil itself. They decompose what dies and they feed what's next. Without fungi, forests would choke under their own debris. Soil wouldn't regenerate, and we wouldn't have access to the flavors, medicines, and nutrients that mushrooms offer. And that's not a world I want to live in. All this isn't just science trivia. This gives you insight into how mushrooms behave. For example, mycelium spreads aggressively when it finds new substrate. That's good to know. Mushrooms only fruit when conditions mimic natural stress or seasonal changes. That's also good to know. Contamination happens when rival organisms, usually faster growing bacteria or mold, outcompete the mycelium. That's also great to know. In mushroom growing, understanding the why can really help you create the right environment to succeed. You're not just tossing spores into a bucket and hoping for the best. You're creating a habitat. You're creating a little micro ecosystem that lets fungi do what they've been doing for over 1 billion years. Now that you have a good understanding of what mushrooms are, a few of the important categories of fungi, which mushrooms you can grow, some fun facts, and some basic understanding of their ecology, let's dive deeper into the mushroom life cycle and how it can be manipulated to grow efficiently and consistently at home or even commercially. Okay, so that marks the end of part 2. Now it's time to move on to part 3, which is basic mycology for growers. You can find a link in the description, or you can find the whole 12-part series pinned in the comments. All right, we'll see you there.